wait, let me check, right? So you go inside the window and you start looking at people, and the guy inside is like, what the heck are they doing? How old are these people, right? And this is exactly what the Prophet ﷺ is saying. Don't go and do this. When you go in front of somebody's house, stand aside. So when they open up the door, you're not feeling that, oh my God, what did I just look into? So and so was there. So the Prophet ﷺ is teaching us these manners, that this is an important thing. And in another one, he mentioned about it that the Prophet, and just look at this hadith, right? This is Abu Dawud. The Prophet ﷺ said, whoever glances through the letter of his brother, without his permission, the house of his brother without his permission, glances into fire. Whoever is looking at it. People think it's funny when they're like driving by and they see apartments, buildings, or like other places, right? And then they start, I wonder what people are doing in there. In like New York City, they always have these like shows where they will show, instead of looking at the stars, people are actually looking at other people's apartments, right? You know how you have so many buildings, so everybody's like, oh, look at so and so and so is doing. That's haram. For Muslim, if that's what the word that you catch, that's haram. Obviously, and you're not supposed to look there. Why? Because they're in their haram. They're in there, and haram to us, Masjidul Haram. Just think of that, Masjidul Haram. That's a sanctity that they're within. And if you go beyond and look into their sanctuary, you have violated them. Even to a point that one of the Imam, one of the great Maliki faqih, Imam Ahmed al-Zarruq, right? He talks about that even when you go inside the houses of people and you pick up, you don't do anything, and they invite, and they open the door for you, and then you are like strolling in their dining room or library or something like that, right? And then you pick up a book, and then you start reading, right? He said that you've actually, what you have done, I wanted to put the book back. That was just too natural. I'm a good actor. He said when you do that, you have violated their privacy. That is something that, you have to ask permission, because you're not in your house. You're at somebody else's house, and you have to seek, unless it's understood, you're at your teacher's house, and you're allowed to go on and study these books, and the teacher is teaching you from, right? That's a different, obviously, Quran school or something like that. These are not public places as the Quran talks about, but these are private places. So you have to respect them. To a point that the Prophet ﷺ would teach that, you can't sit at the place where your host sits, right? You have to wait till your host would actually tell you to sit in a certain spot. Why? Because, and often you would find that out, that, and I do recall, and I would bring that up too, with the durus with like Sheikh Ibrahim Bukr, as some of you may know him from the community, and you'll walk in, and people would walk in, and they would actually really, before they would sit down, they'll just wait. They'll just wait for him to tell them to sit down. And he'll tell them to sit down, and you'll find that out too, even your parents or your father figure, whoever's doing that, they'll tell you to sit down. So if like somebody's working in the kitchen, your mom's working in the kitchen, and your dad is sitting here, so your dad could see your mom, but the guest can't, right? So if she has to say, oh, do you want some hot drink, some hot tea or something? And she's like, no, because we don't have no more hot tea or whatever, right? Then your dad could see it, but the guest is like, maybe you don't want hot tea, maybe you want some cold drink, orange juice, how about that? And she's like, yeah, right? So these are like all these things. We laugh about them, but these are really, this is what the Islamic etiquettes that are involved, that you don't put people, or you don't shame them, right? You don't go out there and put people in a situation where it's like, oh man, I didn't want to do that to you, right? Well, so there are etiquettes that are related to it, so you're not in a bad position. This is what Islam is all about. So you're not in a bad position. On the Day of Judgment, you're not in a bad position. Why? Because Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh. Right? And that's what it is. That's where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this is such a beautiful hadith. I really, on the Day of Judgment, He's going to call, like there are people who are going to be blatantly, openly ridiculed on the Day of Judgment. Right? We don't want to be amongst these people. And this is very serious stuff, right? But then there will be people who would come as individuals. Right, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And He would cover them up. In the hadith it says that He would cover them up. Meaning He won't expose them. And He will ask them, why did you do that? Meaning, why did you do this wrong stuff? And, the response would, I wasn't trying to disobey Allah, right? That's basically the gist of it. I don't really recall the exact hadith, right? And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He would say, I covered you up in the dunya, right? Didn't I cover you up? Meaning, I didn't expose you to people. And on this day, I'm not going to expose you either. SubhanAllah. That's your private matters that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guarded. And in another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said, whoever goes after the private affairs of believers, if you go out and say, well, by the way, I have news for you about so-and-so, right? Whoever does that type of stuff, right? He says, whoever goes after the private affairs of believers, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whoever tries to expose people, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to expose them on the Day of Judgment. He'll just, ridicule them in front of the entire humanity. So this is basically what our deen is teaching us, that, have some modesty, have some haya, have this idea of shame, which in this culture, more and more people are losing this concept, the shame part, right? They don't feel that because of what they talk about, even the anthropologists, and most of you have probably studied that in the introductory courses about guilt versus shame, guilt cultures and shame cultures. Right? Guilt is something that you feel within yourself, right? It's something that, oh man, I should not have done it. Right? And then shame is something that comes from the people around you. They'll shame you into doing something. Oh, shame on you. How could you do that? Shame on you. That's not a good thing. Right? So you feel like, oh man, that's not great. I can't do that. Why? Because people are going to say that to me. They'll stop me from doing bad things, or whatever that thing is. Or guilt culture, where people feel from within themselves that I shouldn't be doing this. Why? It's haram. I shouldn't be doing this. Or it's a sin. It's an enormity. So we have to look into it, how we understand our deen. One last hadith that I want to mention, inshallah. Actually, I'll probably stop with this one, right? But the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned many things about haya. And one of the things that I want to mention that he mentioned is that it's shu'bul iman. It's a branch of faith. Modesty is branch of faith. And this is what it relates to. When people, like the statement that goes like, deal with people how you want others to deal with you, basically, right? So that's the same way, the same respect you should give, the same consideration that you should give to other people. And it starts with individual, right? How we should start, right? That's one thing. But what I don't want to do today is just talk about all these individual things and not communal things, right? There are certain aspects of privacy that are sort of out of our hands, right? And as you are growing as individuals, right, as Americans, as Muslims, you should also be thinking about these issues, right? It's sometimes people don't relate the two. They think that Islam is something on the side, and living in America is something as Muslims, right? And then in public policy or public affairs, that's just a different thing, right? So they'll just, if you ask Muslims about certain things, they'll just sort of feel like, well, I really don't have anything to say on that topic, right? One of them, and I'll mention it because I think it's important that you should. So we talk about modesty. The other extreme on side, and that's what when I was in Sheikh Hamza came, I think it was a couple of weeks ago. He was at Princeton University, and he talked about, he related the incident to, and he talked about that issue too. And he said, if you didn't have this, and I'll use that word, the pornographic culture, that's what we're living within, right? The context that we have, it would never have happened, right? That's the culture you're living in. Welcome to America, if you've been missing that, right? As Muslims, we should be doing our utmost, right, to change things for better. People think that the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, when he said, that iman about how to change things with your hands and then with your tongue, and then think of it as something wrong in your heart, right? It starts here. These are the social things that he's talking about. He's not talking about individuals who declare jihad or some other issues that people tend to think of. He's not. This is something Amar bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy anil Munkar, right? He talked about commanding the good and forbidding the evil, right? But how are we going to